Good morning. As we commemorate once again at Yom HaShoah, continue our rip from the headlines tradition of tackling a Yom HaShoah related subject. And this morning, I wanted to look at the issue of Nakam in Avenging the Holocaust. Came across discussion of a book that came out a couple of years ago called Nakam. Nakam, Hebrew for vengeance. And the idea, some are familiar with the Quentin Tarantino film Inglourious Bastards, that tells a fictional tale of taking revenge against the Nazis. There's the different stories of the partisans, the Bielski brothers, and the like, and especially on a day commemorating memory and those murdered in the Holocaust. Vengeance or the desire to take revenge is something very much. Some people get angry on Yom HaShoah. I know that here locally, the community commemoration last night focused on the telling of stories of survivors, which that number is dwindling. So I think it's even more and more important that Yom HaShoah hear the firsthand accounts of those who experienced the Shoah. I may have mentioned before that the idea of survivor, again, growing up, the idea of a survivor was someone who was in a concentration camp. They had a number on the arm. It was something very telling a story of a concentration camp experience and the like. That definition expanded to anyone who was forced to disrupt their lives because of the Nazis. Children in the kinder transport, children who were hidden, adults who were hidden. And the last night the commemoration heard from twin brothers who were hidden in France during the Holocaust. The father was murdered, the mother and their sister also survived. And the two expressions or phrases that they mentioned about their experience, one was repeating again and again the unforgettable and unforgivable actions of those who murdered Jews or hated Jews or even turned Jews who were hiding in, as well as the fact they spoke with a lot of humor. There was a lot of tongue-in-cheek banter back and forth between the two. The people nearby were kind of arched eyebrows, as it's not a joking matter, but there's a lot of humor, and sometimes it's through humor that Jews survive. That's why Jews consider a sense of humor as such an important part of their Jewish identity. Pew survey has shown that the sense of humor, rates higher than going to shul. How's that for a joke? But the idea of the emotional response to the Holocaust on Yom HaShoah is one that we'll explore, and particularly through the prism of taking revenge. How do we respond to those who wronged us? So first, a couple of selections describing this phenomenon. The first from a synopsis of the book that came out from the Jewish Book Council, source number one. In the aftermath of the Holocaust, survivors of all ages, abilities, nationalities, and ethnicities had to somehow come to terms with the enormous trauma they had suffered before they could fully rebuild their lives. But for a small and determined group of young men and women, the first step towards healing was revenge. Nakam is the chilling true story of the 50 men and women who joined together as a sort of underground army to avenge the 6 million Jews murdered by the Nazis. The year was 1945. A small paramilitary group of Holocaust survivors, many of whom had fought in partisan militias in the forests of Ukraine and Lithuania, simply could not return to everyday life as if nothing had happened, as if the social order had not been breached to the highest degree. They had little faith in the Nuremberg trials to bring about justice, for they considered every citizen of Germany equally complicit in the crimes and thus equally deserving of punishment. So they devised a plan to poison and kill 6 million Germans. Their leader, Abba Kovner, was a charismatic poet and resistance fighter. He, like them, was a Holocaust survivor with a burning desire for revenge on Germany. He became a messianic figure, and while he was smart, driven, and courageous, he could not operate in a vacuum. He had to navigate the forces around him, including the more moderate Yishuv, administrators of Israel, and the Haganah, the Zionist military leaders. The group of avengers, called Nakam, had to solve a serious ethical dilemma before they could fulfill their mission. Should they dedicate themselves to rescuing survivors, forging a path toward health, safety, and the construction of a political homeland, or should they focus on the past and retaliate, sacrificing everything? Dina Parat is an Israeli historian, a professor emeritus in modern Jewish history at Tel Aviv University, and the former chief historian at Yad Vashem. Her writing is scholarly yet accessible, tender yet bold. It draws on hitherto unstudied archival sources and in-depth interviews with the surviving Avengers themselves. All right, I did not yet read the book. I'm not sure I have the patience to read the whole story. I'm fascinated by the concept, but it got the gears working for a discussion as to how Jewish law, Jewish sources would look at this phenomenon. Anyone read the book? I'm happy to hear of your own review. But let's without reading the book, there's an article from 2020, source number 2, that describes some of the efforts that were undertaken by Jews who sought revenge, and there are a number of such efforts. Right, Nakam examines one of them. There are accounts of potentially somewhere in the realm of 40 to 60,000 Germans killed, or 40 to 60,000 Nazis who were avenged, killed mainly by Jews in these types of efforts in the aftermath of World War II. Not the 6 million that Kovner sought, but source number 2 has a selection of some of these details. In the summer of 1963, I was a volunteer on Kibbutz Gvat in Israel. The head of my host family, whose name was Nachman, told me interesting stories of his time in the Jewish brigade of the British Army during World War II. One of the things he told me was that during and after the war, he and others in the brigade searched for Nazis and Germans and killed them. He did so, he said, out of revenge for what the Germans did to his family, to the Jews in Poland. He said that at the time, his heart was ice cold. He had no feelings of mercy or remorse for what he did and for those he killed. He told me that in the evening, they would take German prisoners to the woods or other secluded spots and kill them. Then they would dispose of the bodies. At a roll call in the morning, when British officers asked where these missing men and women were, the Jewish soldiers would say, "Oh, them, they escaped." In 1942, a Palestine Jewish unit dubbed Palestine Buffs had been created by the British because of their need for manpower in the war. However, in 1944, the British government agreed to the formation of an independent Jewish brigade within the British forces. The brigade numbered 5,000 men and was commanded by a mix of Jewish and non-Jewish officers. Unknown to the British commanders set up within the Jewish brigade was a secret unit called Gemul, Hebrew for recompense, payback. Its mission was to seek vengeance against the SS men and Germans who had taken part in the slaughter of the Jews. Mordechai Gichon, former soldier in the Jewish brigade, who would later be one of the founders of the Israeli military intelligence, said, "We looked for big fish, the senior Nazis who had managed to shed their uniforms and return to their homes." The Gemul killers worked in teams of no more than 5 men. When meeting their target, they generally wore British military police uniforms, and they told their target they had come to take a man named so-and-so for interrogation. Most of the time, the Germans came without objection. The Nazi was sometimes killed instantly. Other times, they would be transported to some remote spot before being killed. Shalom Giladi, one of the group's members, related, "In time, we developed quiet, rapid, and efficient methods of taking care of the SS men who fell into our hands. In most cases, the Avengers brought the Nazis to a small line of fortifications in the mountains that held abandoned fortified caves." Giladi said most of those facing the executioners would lose their Nazi arrogance when they heard we were Jews. They would cry, "Have mercy on me, my wife, and my children." We would ask them how many such screams the Nazis had heard in the extermination camps from their Jewish victims. The Gemul operation lasted only 3 months, during which Gemul killed between 100 and 200 Germans. Gemul was closed down when the British, who had heard complaints about the disappearance from German families, understood what was going on. So here is the phenomenon. Here's some details, of efforts that were undertaken to avenge the Jews by murdering the perpetrators of the Shoah. And I don't think it's our place. We certainly can't put ourselves into the minds and the hearts and the motivations of those who experience this. And I think that that's definitely true. In general, one can't. You can't judge a person till you walk a mile in their shoes, and certainly with something as horrific as experiencing the Holocaust, war is hell, and the like. At the same time, what are some of the Jewish sources that can inform our consideration or analysis of this issue? Before we jump in, any questions, comments, reactions? You've heard of this before, you didn't hear this before, or the like. Yeah, Miriam, please.
Yes. I mean, I think that in terms of Nakama, I don't know if it's filtered down, but it's or raised the level today when you see like a big Jewish family or you go to a graduation of a big Jewish school and you say Hitler's Nakama.
Hmm. Yeah, in fact, that is, I think we'll touch upon that, and that's definitely how it's felt. The two the speakers last night, those twins who are now, I guess 91 years old, and they had a slide
Yeah,
presentation at the same time, and the last one was the Danzigers, and they showed the family tree, which
right.
extends, so there's certainly, bacharta b'chayim, choosing
One of
life, which is,
one of them whose bris was yesterday, my
yes,
great nephew.
they reference that.
Yeah,
See, and so this is all you're part of that. You are part of that revenge,
I am.
as we all are. And so
Yeah,
I think I think that's one that has extreme relevance and resonance today. As Am Yisrael Chai, that's how we move forward. And at the same time, this issue, though, flickered within me. What would the Rambam have said and done?
I
I don't
agree.
know, but it's it is, and I think it's especially it resonates after October 7th, and I think it does trickle down into the the sentiments, the political sentiments that we encounter in Israel, or in the Jewish community in general, in terms of a certain type of more worldly openness, which may have defined Jews in pre-war Germany, isn't necessarily so resonant, in a post-Holocaust world or post-October 7th world. A number of articles today were highlighting it's a 100-year-old survivor who also had to lock himself in a safe room on October 7th, and was pointing out kind of how these two events are clearly very, very different. But you think about October 7th, one of the ways it was defined and will never be forgotten as being defined as the single worst day for Jews since the Holocaust. And this number of Jews killed, the highest number of Jews killed on any day since the Holocaust. There's that linkage, and those who survived both, are a bridge to that type of understanding, as well as the fact that many of those Holocaust survivors who also experienced October 7th, who had been in relatively good health, passed away in the months thereafter.
Hmm.
Clearly, that experiencing a trauma again, and also, how does that make us feel? Most of the time, the Holocaust imagery or stories makes me angry, and so that takes us into this Nakam phenomenon.
Right.
Any other reactions before we jump into the sources?
Rabbi, what you're reading about in the Holocaust happens every day. The IDF says they killed so and so, and he's the one that was
Okay.
involved in October 7th or this. It's exactly revenge that you're talking about.
Well, I think that the way the IDF would probably describe it is that this is a wartime situation, and then the idea of specifically avenging individuals is not necessarily. That's not how I read what comes out. Situations. If it's a specific October 7th terrorist, like there was a report yesterday of two of them. It was within the context of an operation against ticking time bomb threats, those who were threatening Israel again. Now, you had after Munich, you could have something similar. There was the operation to try and go after the perpetrators of that, which was somewhat successful, even though if the masterminds got away. I think that here we're talking about we're looking at the sentiments of those who said the Nazis killed 6 million of us, we're going to kill 6 million of them. I don't think you have a similar approach with the IDF. There are people who may have that sentiment, but I don't think you're seeing it exactly the proportionality, nor the declaration that this is vengeance, this is deterrence, this is safety, this is security. But like we were saying before, in our minds it is. In many minds it is. In many minds, the fact that the sentiments that you can sometimes have of that there's no such thing as a good Arab, comes from a more vengeful sentiment rather than from a rational or realistic sentiment. And some of what we're seeing in the headlines, in terms of some of the violence that's taking place from some of the criminals and the fringe, the disaffected youth and the like that's out there, is coming from a sentiment that all bets are off because we're at war and they did to us, so we do to them. And I think that there's a certain distastefulness that the word vengeance has. So let's see how it's filtered through some sources. And we start with the Rambam. And the Rambam in Hilchos Deot, which are his laws of ethical development, moral behavior. A person who takes revenge against a colleague transgresses a scriptural prohibition. As it says, do not take revenge. Lo si kon velo si tor. Even though one is not liable for lashes for taking revenge, right? We're not going to hold you accountable for punishment. It's a very bad trait, very bad. Instead, a person should train himself to rise above his feelings, above all worldly things. For men of understanding, consider all these things as vanity and emptiness, which are not worth seeking revenge for. Right? So I think the Rambam is describing a certain aspirational equanimity of emotion. Right, when the difference, the person, the person who has more conservative political leanings is a liberal who got mugged. Right, the Rambam is describing a certain aspirational, revenge is bad. Don't take revenge, and I think we see that it's more of aspirational than actual, because if a person does take revenge, they're not punished for that revenge. Right, similar to. The verse that the Rambam mentions is that do not take revenge, and don't bear a grudge, right? What's the difference? Revenge is you do something to me, I do something to you. Bearing a grudge is the example the Talmud gives. If I ask you for something and you say no, and then you ask me for the same thing, I say, well, you didn't give it to me, but I'm still going to give it to you. So there's a certain type of, it's more emotional than actual. But anyone who does take revenge, someone hits me and I hit them, I'm not going to be punished for that. There's a certain recognition that this is not a natural, a vengeful response is not necessarily forgiven, but there's an acknowledgement as it's understood. Right? It's kind of you're pleading guilty with extenuating circumstances and the like. And the Rabbi Shneur Zalman of Ladi, the first Alter Chabad Rebbe, in his Shulchan Aruch, where he's talking about the different laws, one should erase any feelings of revenge from one's heart and never remind oneself of it. Right? Don't even let it bother you. You should just move on. Now, in general, in practical terms, in Jewish law, where is this issue coming up? Like, what kind of practical, where is this coming up? The Shulchan Aruch is not going to describe someone like, I hit you, so don't want to hit me. That's not really what it's talking about. Generally, where these issues come up within the Shulchan Aruch practical Jewish law relate to financial. Right? You financially wronged me, I should not bear that grudge, and I should never remind myself of it, and I should move it forward. That's in fact, the full, chapter 156 that the Shulchan Aruch Harav is addressing. That's what comes up. It's almost, it's too terrible to talk about this idea of vengeance against this type of violent behavior. We have specific comments. The Rambam, be a bigger person than the other one, or we have the Shulchan Aruch Harav, move forward and forget. These are more, these are more moral terms than being able to govern actual behavior. Other than the fact that someone who takes revenge is not going to be punished for with the lashes. Rabbi Joseph Soloveitchik, the Rav, talks about this within the context of the Exodus. All right, we just celebrated Pesach, and when it tells the story of the night of the killing of the firstborn, there's an emphasis over and again that the Jews had to stay in their homes. Right? Don't leave your home until the morning. And so, in commenting about why the emphasis on the staying inside while the Egyptians are being punished, the Rav talks about that vengeance belongs to God, and keeping them inside was so that they not be tempted to pile it on also. Right? Let's take a look at source number 5. Freedom does not rid a man of his morals. On the contrary, adds to his morals. The transition from slavery to freedom is very critical. The masters who exploited, tortured, humiliated find themselves suddenly at the mercy of the slaves to whom they show no concern, display no human emotion. The natural reaction of the one who was suddenly freed is to avenge himself on the tyrant who murdered his baby, who disgraced his daughter, who mercilessly beat him for any minor infraction. It is usually a bloody, ruthless, and vengeful transition. Fear of an upheaval haunted all the tyrants of antiquity as well as those of modern times. Rebellion meant total destruction. European history knows of the Peasants' Rebellion in medieval Germany, the bloody Cossack revolt in Ukraine. They were eager to settle a long account of cruelty. Did anything of that kind happen on the night of the Exodus? Did the liberated slaves set fire to the exclusive neighborhood of their former overlords? Did the teenagers at least smash the window panes of the officers who were their taskmasters, would assemble to plan restrictive and sadistic edicts? Nothing of the sort. Not one person was hurt, not one house destroyed. The liberated slaves had the courage to withdraw, to defy the natural call of blood. It is unique in the history of revolutions. So in some of the illustration examples that the Rav mentions, it's not, he was one who lived through the Holocaust and the experiences. Not he witnessed it. He came to the U.S. in 1932, but he was very familiar with what was happening. So it's clear that that experience is coursing through the sentiment, but you see the way the Rav is presenting it, the idea that from a historical perspective, the Jewish people have been told to place themselves beyond the instinctive reactions that oppressed and wronged people have had. It sounds a little bit like turn the other cheek, right? That's not. It's not necessarily the exclusive reaction, right? That's a very Christian reaction, but let's not forget where Christianity comes from. But there is this idea of tolerating and holding back and the like, and that I think is an expression of the sentiments that the Rambam and the Shulchan Aruch Harav are expressing. Even from our very origins, we're told to withhold. So that I think is how Judaism views revenge. We don't like it. We don't want it. We should be bigger than it. We shouldn't fight back. Question: What about the perpetrator? What about the one who commits the offense? Are they able to transcend it ever? And I think we have an interesting example of the action that is committed, the crime committed, and whether that person can transcend it or not in a situation the Talmud mentions. What happens if someone who does something bad against Jewish law in their Gentile status then converts to Judaism? Does their sin cross over from their Gentileness to their Jewishness, and how are they held accountable? So source number 6, Rabbi Hanina says, if Noachide cursed the name of God and afterward converts to Judaism, he is exempt from punishment since his trial procedure changed, the death penalty to which he is subject also changed. Right? We're not allowed to curse God. Cursing God a certain way is a capital offense. So if someone is a Gentile curse God and then converts to Judaism, their offense took place, but are they held liable? And Rabbi Hanina, in a certain way, lets them off on a technicality because their trial is now different, so now they're exempt. Coming here, if a descendant of Noah struck and killed another Gentile or engaged in intercourse with the wife of another Gentile, and he then converts to Judaism, he's exempt. What if he committed another type of a crime that's a capital offense? Murder or sexual assault? No, converts to Judaism, he's exempt. But if he did this to an Israelite, killing a Jew or engaging in intercourse with the wife of a Jew, and then converted, he is liable. The sin carries over. Right? The crime against the Jew is something that is not wiped away by the conversion. Right? We talk about conversion, that a person who converts is like a newborn child. On some level, it kind of wipes the criminal slate clean, unless the offense is against a Jew. Unless you're wondering how this then carries over, well, Tosfot comments on the spot that this is different between Dinei Adam and Dinei Shamayim. Right? We're not really going to try the person in court for their crimes beforehand, but God doesn't forget. And there's Dinei Shamayim, the law of heaven will still apply to any crimes that are committed in the Gentile state. But in terms of, what is that like for, someone who converts, who committed these crimes against Jews? The last expression in Sanhedrin about a Gentile who may have killed a Jew and then converts, what's that like? What if a Nazi converts? Can a Nazi convert? We talked about this a couple of years ago, and how that applies to, how do you look at the person who committed such offenses and then converts to Judaism? So source number 7 tells the story in Gittin about Nebuzaradan, who was the general of Nebuchadnezzar, who killed 2,110,000 people, and in Jerusalem he killed 940,000 people in one stone. At that moment, we realized, oh my God, I'm killing so many people. Maybe this is going to be bad. Maybe I should repent. He fled, sent us to his house a document dealing what was to be done with his property, converted to Judaism. So you have basically a Nazi converting to Judaism. The Gemara adds that some of Haman's descendants studied Torah in Bnei Brak, some of his sister's descendants taught children of Torah in Jerusalem, some of Sacherev's descendants taught Torah in public. Who are they? Shmai and Avtayim, the teachers of Hillel the Elder. So again, it doesn't say that necessarily Nevu. You got to wonder who was the converting rabbis for Nebuzaradan, who would let that happen. But how do you deal with such heinous individuals converting? And so, leaving aside how exactly, it's almost like they have to hide their identity to get there. So Rabbi Moshe Steinberg analyzes the situation, source number 8. If we judge the matter based on humanity in general, or our national dignity or emotions in particular, it's clear that our conscience would not allow us to answer in the affirmative, that this can happen. A person like this, whose hands are full of Jewish blood, has no place in the camp of Israel. His place is far from the house of Israel. How difficult would it be to say to him, you are our brother? But from the perspective of dry halacha, I can see no reason not to accept it. Again, separating the head from the heart. The heart says no, but the intellectual approach to Jewish law, checks off the boxes, says yes. And so I think that here too, there's the aspirational approach to revenge, which we should be able to let bygones be bygones, but let's be real people here. We're not going to be able to let go so easily. And I think that tension is also found in terms of how we respond to the downfall of our enemies, right? Very famously, we talk about, you have a couple of the sources there in 9, 10, 11, right? Very famously, one of the most famous is quoted as a mission in Pirkei Avot, source 10, right? Bin fol oivcha al tisamach. Don't exult when your enemy falls, right? From Mishlei. But Mishlei also has, when the righteous prosper, the city exults. When the wicked perish, there are shouts of joy. We're happy when the wickedness is eliminated. Tehillim 58:11, source 9. The righteous man will rejoice when he sees revenge. Right? He will bathe his feet in the blood of the wicked. Right? We have a positive emotional response to the destruction of the wicked, even when there is revenge. So, we have a complicated emotional response, even expressed by our scriptures, right? Tehillim, King David HaMelech, Mishlei, Shlomo HaMelech. Mishlei seems to have both don't rejoice, but do rejoice, right? It's a little bit of both. So, I think Dennis Prager, captures some of the distinction. And this was an article he wrote after bin Laden was killed by U.S. forces. All those rabbis, source 12, and others who think it's immoral or un-Jewish to celebrate bin Laden's death will one day have to confront a Jew named Ari Hassenberg, a prisoner at Auschwitz-Birkenau. As quoted by Holocaust historian Saul Friedlander, after one of Auschwitz subgroups was bombed by the Allies, Hassenberg's reaction was, to see a killed German, that was why we enjoyed the bombing. Was Hassenberg's reaction wrong or un-Jewish? I don't think so. What I suspect distinguishes Hassenberg from those who lament celebrating the death of the truly evil is that Hassenberg experienced true evil. There's a difference between the first-person reaction and the third-person reaction. Those who have experienced it are in a very different place to gauge or judge emotional reaction than those of us who are hearing about it or responding to second or third-hand recorded accounts. And I think that can also explain, the different reactions between Tehillim and Mishlei. And Shmuel HaKatan would like for people who are not experiencing it to aspire that celebrating someone's downfall isn't really a quote unquote Jewish ideal reaction. It's something that we want to transcend. We want to be more like the Rambam and the Shulchan Aruch Harav. At the same time, if we experience the avla, if we experience the evil, we experience the horrific behavior, it's going to be very hard to judge such an exaltation over the elimination of such evil. And I think, getting to, the comment that was made before about the Avenging against Hitler being, the Jewish future, is something that Rabbi Sachs talks about. Carrying further the idea that Hassenberg experienced it. So Sachs also talks about when it comes to forgiveness. Source number 13, in Judaism, only the victim can forgive. Supposing somebody injures my next door neighbor, can I forgive the person who did it? What have I got to do with it? I'm a third person. There's no vicarious forgiveness in Judaism. And the reason there's no vicarious forgiveness in Judaism is there's no vicarious guilt in Judaism. Jeremiah and Ezekiel both say the soul that sins shall die, nobody else. So only the victim can forgive. Even God can't forgive on behalf of the victim. As on Yom Kippur, Yom Kippur works to atone the sins between people and God, not between people. The late Rabbi A.J. Heschel writes in his response to the Sunflower, Simon Wiesenthal's memoir, that on Yom Kippur, we say the Day of Atonement only atones for sins between us and God. It doesn't atone for sins between us and our fellow until our fellow forgives us, because even God can't forgive us on behalf of our fellow human beings. He can only forgive offenses against himself. The trouble with the Holocaust is all the victims are dead. So we can't forgive the perpetrators of the Holocaust. To think we can is to misunderstand the nature of forgiveness. On the other hand, we can certainly seek reconciliation with the next generation and with the faiths that might have contributed in some way to the anti-Semitism or what have you. We certainly don't harbor a grudge. We don't. I never met a Holocaust survivor whose life was filled with hate or anything of the kind. So no, you cannot forgive, but you begin a new way together. Very much aspirational, and Sachs is describing his experience. And I think every experience is going to be different. Rabbi Shlomo Aviner was addressing another issue that we've spoken about previously with regards to buying German cars or German reparations. It was a very famous episode when the Germans offered the state of Israel reparations and Ben-Gurion was going to accept them. There was a lot of opposition from Holocaust survivors in Israel, in particular Menachem Begin. Things got very, very heated. And how can you, it's basically blood money. They're buying their way into forgiveness, especially it was necessary. We're talking about Israel that was not the startup nation that it is today. And, so there was a whole discussion and there was a halachic discussion. And so Rabbi Aviner is describing some of that halachic conversation that took place, I guess, at this point now, almost some 70 years ago. And, he says, he sums up the issue, right? He says that, from a halachic perspective, there's no prohibition to take money from Germany, right? Just think about, the Rambam or Shulchan Aruch Harav, from a legalistic, aspirational point of view, right? You separate, the action of the past, from the present. But there still is there's a value in not accepting it, because these are, those who perpetrated murder against Jews. But how does he conclude? It's a personal decision of each and every one. And I think that's getting into what Prager and Sachs mentioned in terms of the one who experienced it, or how Holocaust survivors are responding. Right? We can sometimes generalize based on our own experience, or individuals how they've publicized their sentiments, but it's always going to be very, very personal. Which on some level, that's where vengeance lies, is within the heart of each person, we can't judge people's hearts; only God does. And I think that kind of brings it full circle from the desire that vengeance not be present in the ideal service of the Jew, but the Jewish experience has been one that has certainly lent itself from our enemies' treatment of the Jewish nation to prompt those types of sentiments of the Nakam group, the Abba Kovners, or or the Gemul, or the Mordechai Gichons and the like that did want to take vengeance, and those that did exact vengeance. And in some way, I think that both approaches, the more forgive, the more vengeful, are all part of that complicated religious and spiritual life of the Jew, both in theory and in practice, that are important to look at and address because it gives us the totality. It's kind of like those who, in the Jewish community more broadly, are accepting the idea of tikkun olam. Let's make the world better. Right? Tikkun olam only exists, as we say every day when we say the Aleinu prayer, l'taken olam b'malchut Shaddai. Right? We're fixing the world the way God wants it fixed, not the way some sort of outside conventions want it fixed. And so I think that the Rambam's aspirational elevation of our spiritual, emotional, and behavioral selves is one thing, but the world is messy, and we can aspire. We have the real life, and we have the personal experiences of those who are in the situation where they may be prompted to take these actions. All of that comes together on the subject of avenging the Holocaust. And I think that for those of us who didn't experience it ourselves and seeking to find our way forward, I think building and growing and solidifying and strengthening the Jewish community and our world around us, that's the best way for us to respond, while recognizing that we still are fighting evil enemies and should not lose the familiarity with the need sometimes to take that strong action. And hopefully, on a day like Yom HaShoah, where we're commemorating the murder of the Holocaust, and it was a pivot in terms of where things have gone since then, in terms of who would have imagined all sorts of things 1948, 3 years later, and especially what's going on today. Hopefully we'll take our engagement with the past to fortify us now and into the future. Happy to conclude with any comments, reactions, questions, and the like.
Yeah, hi, Rabbi.